It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Unfair and indefensible, that's what the Prime Minister says about the burgeoning welfare bill. But not all his MPs are convinced.
If we're going to make poor people poorer, then there'll be a number of MPs who won't be able to sign up to that.
I promise you, waiting times in the NHS have gone down. It will not go private.
That was more than a decade ago. The Conservatives then tried to take the politics out of the NHS. But has that experiment failed? £250 a year off your energy bills. But will that placate anti-pylon protesters?
People are finding that their communities will be destroyed and their house prices will plummet. To be told you get a token amount off your bill is incredibly patronising, and people are really angry about this.
Oh,
slidey.
Slidey. Good girl. Well done.
And should fathers get more rights to time off after the birth of a baby? Joining us today, Labour MP Peter Prinsley, Conservative MP and Shadow Paymaster General Rick Holden, journalist and author Xing Zheng, and LBC presenter and podcaster Ian Dale. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Yes, let's start with what the Prime Minister Keir Starmer said yesterday about the current benefit system. Let's show you this headline in BBC News. Starmer says benefit system unfair and indefensible. He was addressing backbench Labour MPs at their regular meeting in Parliament. He went on to say that the current situation of large numbers of young welfare recipients runs contrary to those deep British values. Is he right, Peter?
Well, I was at the meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party last night, and of course the Prime Minister said a lot of things. We certainly do need to do something about the enormous welfare problem that we have in this country. We spend too much money on welfare, and we have too many people who are on long-term welfare.
But the answer to the question about his words, that the current situation of lots of young people claiming benefits for one reason or another, not in training, not in education or employment, runs contrary to those deep British values that if you can work, you should. Does it run contrary to that?
Well, I agree with him that we must do whatever we can to encourage young people to be either working, in employment or in training. And the idea that, you know, somehow it's become an acceptable thing for large numbers of people to be none of those things is wrong.
Right.
And so I agree with the Prime Minister.
Richard, do you agree? Does it run contrary to those British values?
Yeah, I think it does. And we saw, actually, between 2010 and the start of the pandemic, actually a real reduction in the number of people on some of those long-term benefits.
During the years of austerity under George Osborne, he took a lot of money out of the welfare system.
A lot of people back into it, more than 4 million net jobs over the 14 years as well. I think what we saw in the pandemic is a lot of people going onto welfare probably for the first time. And actually, that's something in our manifesto when we ran for the general election that we said, you know, we want to do a huge amount about, take a lot of money out of the welfare bill, get people back into work. What I worry about at the moment, though, is a good words from the Prime Minister, but at the same time, you're seeing the Labour government putting up barriers to employers taking on more people with some of the employment bill, and also particularly the national insurance rise, which is really hammering. I had literally this week in my own constituency, had a care home coming in to see me to say this is actually going to stop them employing people. We've seen real issues around the hospitality sector as well. So I think it's a bit of the rhetoric's all well and good, but you know, actually the actions of the Labour government don't always meet them.
Well, there are questions about whether you can legitimately take that amount of money that they're talking about, billions out of the welfare. The package, we're told, it's reported, would impose £5 billion of cuts and require the long-term sick to prepare for work. But the words that he used, Keir Starmer, it's indefensible, it's unfair. I think the group of MPs, Labour MPs who are in favour, like Peter, of doing something about the welfare bill, so there's a moral duty to get young people off welfare. Do you agree?
Well, I think if you speak to young people nowadays, and, you know, young people are more likely than people of older ages to be on 0 hours contracts, to be in insecure work. So, yes, it is a British value to be hardworking, but it is on the understanding that hard work needs to pay fairly and equally. And, you know, the Labour government is going to introduce the equal the Equal Workers' Rights bills. So, you know, they are trying to do something about it. But I think this kind of idea, and I really worry that it plays into a stereotype of young people being somehow work shy or not wanting to work or not being able to work. I think what the Labour government needs to do is to stop using kind of divisive language like this to try and pose it as a moral duty. Because if you look at the language around this idea of working people being the people who deserve to be paid better, you know, the implication is that non-working people don't deserve that same respect, care and attention. And if you speak to young people who have been out of work, who aren't able to get the training or skills that they need, it is respect, care and attention that they deserve.
Ian?
Well, of course he's right. But I wonder, Joe, if we'd been having this conversation, say, 5 years ago, and Boris Johnson had said that, whether Labour MPs would have given him any slack for saying something like that. Because I think, look, there are clearly many people, and we've seen the figures, 1.2 million people, younger people, are not in employment, training or education. Well, why is that? Now, a proportion, and I agree with you, not all of them are work shy, but a proportion of them will find it easier to stay in the benefits system than look for work. And something has got to be done about that. And if you're going to try and reduce borrowing, I'm afraid the welfare budget will always be the first target, because it's so massive. I mean, it's hundreds of billions of pounds. So clearly, Liz Kendall is going to look at each and every benefit, and she should do that, and she will get a lot of political flack for it from the Labour Party. And I suppose the other point is, it's interesting that Keir Starmer seems to be attacking a lot of traditional Labour supporters. I mean, first of all, it was the pensioners on the winter fuel allowance, and now it's people on benefits who traditionally would have been Labour voting people.
Peter?
Look, I don't think that the Prime Minister's attacking traditional Labour voters. What the Prime Minister's got to do...
No, but they will see it that way.
They may do, but the Prime Minister's got a huge job to try and put this country right again. And Liz Kendall, in particular, has to do something about the problems we've got with employment and benefits. And I think that the measures that they're going to introduce, certainly to try and get the job centres actually working as job centres and getting people really... giving people proper information about how they might get back into work is the way to go. I mean, we cannot possibly carry on with a situation when we have so many people who are simply in long-term not work.
Well, talking of traditional, just to use your word, Labour MPs, this Diane Abbott tweeted, "I would have liked to have queried Keir Starmer at last night's meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party about the impact of his proposed cuts to welfare. She's not a fan. Unfortunately, I and other colleagues were told the meeting was full. Keen on dissent in other countries, not so much here." What would you say to her?
Well, certainly the Committee Room 14 in the Parliament was completely full, but I don't know whether Diane Abbott was unable to get there or simply didn't arrive on time. I don't know.
I would just say one other thing. I had the Essex Chamber of Commerce in this week into Parliament, and one of the things that they have also raised, alongside the national insurance rise, which has really hammered them, is also the fact that for young people particularly, the minimum wage is now the same for those 18 plus, and it used to be 23 plus. And that is really taking people off taking on young people, because it's more of a gamble if they've never been in work before.
You wouldn't have supported that rise for 18-year-olds?
I think the danger is that actually what you say is that you don't get that first job. You know, for me, my first job in hospitality was a real opening to me doing all sorts of other things later in life. It gave me a huge amount of confidence to speak to people, etc. And I worry that with that now minimum wage being the same for somebody who's just left school as for somebody in their 20s or 30s with a lot of life experience, I think it's going to be targeted against young people getting those jobs.
Let's move on to something else. Take a look at this.
I'm on the waiting list, so you can wait, all right? You can wait long while I'm waiting for a bed, all right? And the waiting list is going to go up, so you can wait. So you can wait. Let you wait.
Well, that was the former Conservative Health Secretary Andrew Lansley being heckled back in 2012. He was arriving for a meeting about reforming the NHS that became known as the Lansley Reforms. He tried to take the politics out of the NHS by creating NHS England, a body where professionals rather than ministers directly oversee running the health health service? Well, today, let me show you this headline in The Guardian from the current Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, announcing that NHS England, that organisation set up back in 2012 or 2013 to cut workforce by half as Streeting restructures. The Health Secretary will shrink NHS England's workforce to save money and avoid duplication. Starting with you, Richard, can you take the politics out of the NHS?
It's always been pretty tough to do, but I would say that, look, actually, it's a bit like with the last question, really. Talking the right language, as far as I'm concerned, about wanting to, restructure the NHS, get it more productive, get more resources to the front line. My mum retired as a ward clerk in the NHS just last year, and I really do think that if there's something anything we can do to get resources to the front line, that's great. Well, let's see actually what the proposals are down the line. There's been a lot of headlines from Wes Streeting about reforming the NHS. He's sort of made it a bit of a mantra for himself.
Sure.
But and this is.
But this is in the context of whether the Lansley reforms and that attempt to take the politics out of the NHS ever worked, did it, Peter?
Well, I don't think that the Lansley reforms were particularly useful. I've been an NHS consultant surgeon for more than 30 years, and I've seen reforms come and go. The question is it necessary to have some sort of arm's-length body to run the health service? I was talking to my colleagues about this. We don't have an organisation that runs the army called Guns England. The health service is clearly a political matter. It's right at the top of people's political concerns. And the question I would say is, if NHS England didn't exist, would we have to invent it?
Right. Is that true? You can't take the politics out of the NHS, and should you?
No, you can't. Politicians will get blamed for it on the doorstep, regardless of how many quangos or intermediary organisations they put up in their way as a buffer. And, he is right in saying that, it's one of the biggest issues for voters. It was one of the biggest issues of the last general election. So this idea that, you have to slash red tape, the Mail called it the bonfire of the bureaucrats. It plays very well to this kind of voter dissatisfaction that the NHS is spending too much money on bureaucrats and not enough on frontline services.
Right. It's what the coalition government tried to do and arguably failed to do with those Lansley reforms. It's been over a decade and they were complicated and they cost the Conservative Party to some extent.
Well, this is one of those hoary old chestnuts. I remember in 2004, I think Liam Fox was then Shadow Health Secretary, and he was banging on about taking the politics out of the NHS. How can you possibly do that when £1 in £5 that the government spends goes on the health service? You take it out of politics, you take it out of democratic accountability. And I think people do want to know that there is a minister responsible for a particular part of the NHS. And this is right through government. One of the worst things the John Major government ever did was create all of these quangos and agencies. The Highways Agency, or whatever it's called nowadays, totally unaccountable to the Secretary of State for Transport.
Right, so you admit a wasted decade. It was a wasted decade of those Lansley reforms, and we've spent all this time watching successive governments unpick them.
Well, look, I think Ian's right in the idea that overall, the public won't accept the fact that ministers aren't overall responsible, because they are.
So it was a failure to do what Andrew Lansley...
But let's just pick up on the point that Peter made. We don't have a thing called, Guns England.
No, not a great title.
But we do
Good idea, though.
But we do have the army, which is operationally independent of politicians, and we do have the Navy, which is also operationally independent. So the idea that, and also you wouldn't want, for example, one of the things, actually the big successes we've seen over the last few years is actually some of the, which was introduced by Labour, expanded by the Conservatives, academisation of schools. That has been a success. It's in more kids going to good and outstanding primary and secondary schools, which now is possibly in jeopardy under the government now looking at some of its reforms bringing forward. So it seems that on one side they're looking at centralising on one side, and this looks like, we're not quite sure exactly what Wes is saying, apart from he seems to want to cut some bureaucracy. So
that's a good thing.
I'm all in favour of cutting it.
Are you trying to remind Richard what he believes in?
Does it rather than say he's
all I'm saying is, look, Wes Streeting is a great media performer. It's why you have him on the show all the time. It's why everybody in the media wants him on, because he talks a good game. And you're right, the test is, will he deliver? Well, I think in the first 7 or 8 months of the Labour government, he's been the outstanding minister, possibly along with Angela Rayner, though I don't agree with anything she does. But I think they've both got a grip. They know which levers to pull, and many cabinet ministers, I'm afraid, don't.
Right. Well, I mean, cutting 6,500 jobs pretty well in half. But what do you say to Richard's point about plenty of other examples where there is a bit of distance between government and delivery of services?
You know, I think what the people want, what the patients want, is they want delivery of services.
Yeah.
They're much less interested in the structures. I mean, what I've been saying is we must make sure everybody can get an emergency dental appointment. We must make sure that people can access their general practitioner. We must do something about the huge surgical waiting lists. Now, I'm not sure that having an organisation called NHS England...
So would you get rid of it altogether?
Well, that would be a bold move, but as I said earlier, if it didn't exist, would you have to invent it?
Right. Well, in terms of delivery, and to take your point, Ian, about whether or not West Streeting will actually be able to achieve some of the things he's saying, let's look at this headline in The Times. Why has the civil service grown so big but not more productive? The problems are not new, and governments have been vowing to streamline Whitehall for decades. But according to one expert, the central problem is there's no one in charge.
Well, there's no one at work. That's the problem. They're 75% of them are working from home.
Well, that's slightly different to there's no one in charge. We do have a sort of cabinet secretary, but is it to the point that these things aren't as easy as they look in order to sort of shrink Whitehall?
No, and I think successive governments, as that headline has pointed out, have been trying to streamline Whitehall again and again and again. In fact, I think probably the only government that you can say has streamlined the civil service is Doge in the White House, and look at how that has panned out for the American people.
Right.
So really, when you talk about streamlining the civil service and the services that they provide to the public, that is going to always be a gargantuan task. It's not really something that can be done at a snap of a finger by a single government. And is it desirable? Well, this is the issue. You're delivering services for an entire country, millions and millions of people. Is it really desirable that you're trying to shrink it to its absolute minimum?
Right.
I'm not sure it is.
Well, as Zinger's mentioned, Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency in the States under Elon Musk. Let's have a look at this. Do we need more of this, Peter and Richard? There he is, Elon Musk, the tech billionaire, taking a chainsaw to what he calls government waste. Peter, is that the sort of thing that West Streeting should be doing, and others?
Absolutely not. I mean, I'm utterly appalled at what I'm seeing happening in America. The idea that an unelected man like Mr. Musk can walk around a stage brandishing a chainsaw is a complete outrage.
Right. I mean, Richard, but in terms of the metaphor, perhaps to one side, is that the sort of thing we need?
I mean, obviously, we have an unelected Attorney General in Lord Hermer doing all sorts of things at the moment, which they're advising the government on everything from the Chagos Islands to everything else, and nobody seems to be holding him accountable in the UK. Look, on the broader point, I think we do need to... I want to see reform. I want to see more resources at the front line wherever possible. And there are certain things that governments do, and the government's talking a good talk in some areas on that, but in other areas, like education, or in my own area, we've got C2C Rail and Greater Anglia, two of our best performing rail operators, now being brought into government control, which is what's going to happen with the Department of Transport over the next few years as they reorganise that, rather than actually, delivering services for people. So I think there's the government seems slightly schizophrenic about this.
Right, but why didn't you cut more in the way of bureaucracy if you thought it was a waste?
No, well, I mean, we did quite a lot in that regard, but I think one of the big things, as I said before, is we had the pandemic, which was a huge hit right across the country. We obviously had plans going forwards at the election to both cut further into welfare and obviously around bureaucracy. But the public voted for Peter's party to take up the mantle at the moment on that.
Right. I mean, 6,500 people are going to go from NHS England. What were they doing in the first place, do you think?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the problem here. As you know, Joe, I've got a new podcast out where politics meets history. I thought I'd get the plug in.
Yeah, well done.
And one thing you do have to learn from is history. And what you learn is that there's nothing new. When the coalition government came in 2010, Francis Maude was heading up the Cabinet Office, and his responsibility was on government efficiency. And he actually did a brilliant job in abolishing huge numbers of quangos. But what you have to learn is that the civil service will always fight back against that. And I can't remember who succeeded Francis Maude, but whoever it was, shall we say, wasn't quite as zealous as he was in keeping these quangos under control. So if you look at the number of quangos now, compared to then, they've mushroomed.
Right, but there is a counter-argument. We did have Brexit that did require quite a lot of civil service work after the EU referendum, and then the pandemic. Isn't that the reason, partly, that the civil service has got so big?
Yes, it is. The pandemic, certainly. I mean, you can't blame the Cameron government for increasing civil service after Brexit, apart from the fact that they didn't actually prepare for it. I remember interviewing George Osborne 10 days before the vote and saying, well, how many civil servants have you got working on the possibility of the vote going the other way? And he said none. I could not believe what I was hearing.
Why did it get so big during those Conservative years?
Well, I mean, as you know, Joey, as Ian said, you know, Francis Morden, the reforms which he and others did at the time, including Baroness Finn, who's now
that was pre-2015.
Cabinet Office Minister with me. You know, they did a huge amount to reduce it. But the real growth came when we had the pandemic, and there's a huge amount of government support. They need to go to all parts of the economy incredibly quickly, and we saw a lot of growth from that.
Right. Well, that was justified then. Are you sure it wouldn't be risky to get rid of large numbers of civil servants?
Look, I don't think we should be thinking of the civil service as somehow some sort of enemy problem.
Well,
you know, the civil service is necessary for the government to run the country, but you know, it needs to be carefully thought about exactly what they're all doing and whether they're all necessary. And it's not a bad idea for this to be reviewed.
Right, reviewed. And do you have any particular thoughts on what should be done in terms of cuts potentially to the civil service?
Well, as I said, I'm not sure that we need NHS England. You know, I think there are probably other areas of public affairs where we could probably do with less civil servants, but it's not something that is something I know much about.
And one of the things I'm a bit concerned about at the moment is when you look at things like the employment bill coming through now.
You're keen on that employment bill or not, as the case may be. No, they're talking about it. Yeah.
But it's honestly, you know, clause 18 of it, where you're basically going to have a sort of a snooper's charter for people speaking in pubs, for example. You know, major implications around you know, freedom of speech. When if somebody happens to think that somebody else might be offended by a comment somebody makes going into a pub, who's going to regulate this? It's an entire new branch of regulation being brought in by the government. You know, more civil servants, which Peter says he wants to, you know, have a review of. All his government seems to do is reviewing them up.
Right. So that's clause 18. Zin, would you like to defend the Employment Rights Bill?
I mean, I think if you look at the vast majority of the Employment Rights Bill, what it is doing is trying to ensure that people are fairly paid for their work, that employers can't get away with bad practices, and also it acknowledges that the world of work has changed a lot. So we talked about young people being out of work, young people needing to depend on benefits. The vast majority of young people who are struggling to find gainful employment are being shunted into 0 hours contracts that don't pay well, where they're open to abuse from bad employers. And that is absolutely no way to kind of encourage the next generation into meaningful employment. So
we're going to come to this as well in a minute. So this is a curtain raiser. What's clause 17, out of interest?
I don't know.
No, good. Let's talk about planning. You seem to have such detailed knowledge. I don't know. Let's talk about planning and energy, because yesterday the government announced that anyone living within 500 metres of new or upgraded electricity pylons will get around £250 a year off their bills, paid for by a surcharge of around 80 pence a year on everyone else's bills. This is what one protester had to say about the proposals.
Well, it's incredibly patronising and it's a really poorly thought through proposal, and government knows we've told them several times that it won't work. So firstly, if you are suffering to the extent I've just described, if your house has lost huge value and you can't sell it, if your farming business is destroyed, if your tourist business will have to close down, to be told you get a token amount off your bill is incredibly patronising, and people are really angry about this.
Peter?
Well, what I would say is that lady is incredibly angry about this. I don't know what evidence that she's got that there are large numbers of people whose houses are going to fall in value, they won't be able to sell, and their farms won't be able to work. I mean, these are all things that this lady on the screen has just said.
But is £250 a year enough to convince people to have energy infrastructure near them?
I've actually got no idea how that figure of £250 was arrived at, but what I would say is that we must do something in this country to sort out the national grid. We simply don't have enough grid connections for all the new energy infrastructure that we're putting up. My son-in-law is an energy engineer. He's involved in the planning of some of this stuff. There are huge delays in getting the relay stations put in and all the gadgets that we need to bring this massive offshore wind energy into the country. And would you be happy something must be done.
Well, would you be happy living next to pylons?
Well, I don't think that I would like to have a pylon in my garden, but, you know, the pylons will have to go somewhere.
Right, Richard.
Look, I've got this issue in my constituency, so it's right between, right down the side of Billericay and Basildon. And it's a real concern for local people, actually, this energy infrastructure. They're not against extra infrastructure.
But not in their backyard.
No, I wouldn't say that. And Peter's right that we do need, if we're going to have this offshore wind and those connections need to come in, we need to go somewhere. But I just want the government to pursue what the Germans did, what was in the Conservatives' manifesto in the last general election, which was underground first for electricity infrastructure.
Right, but according to the National Energy Systems Operator,
yes,
pylons over their lifetime are on average 5 times cheaper than underground cables. So pylons are the easiest, cheapest option.
Well, I think there might be a bit of a vested interest in there by the operators in which you talk about. And I think there's actually, I think that if you look at it, you've got issues with, wind, the wind turbines not being able to work when there's issues at the moment, when there's too much wind, right? And there's obviously going to be an issue over time if you've got huge amounts of our energy reliance coming off the North Sea through pylons, right? I think if they're undergrounded, there's all sorts of new technologies in that space. It's not all the traditional.
But if it was the cheapest, why wouldn't politicians go for underground cables? Because you wouldn't have the opposition. You do underground cables. It can't be cheaper.
I really think. Well, at the moment now we're hearing that people are going to be paid £250 a year off their energy bills from some fund or something.
Well, surcharge on other people.
Some surcharge on other people. So I think actually, there's clearly a cost going to be mounted there. Let's have a look at what realistically the cost is. 5-10 times as much. Constant numbers bounded about. I don't think it'll be anywhere near that if we had a proper plan to get undergrounding right across the country.
Peter?
Look, there are energy experts who've looked carefully at this. I mean, we're sitting here as political figures. The fact is that the consensus amongst the energy engineers is that what needs to be done is quickly to install a system of pylons which will allow us to get our energy infrastructure sorted out. We are vulnerable in this country, especially now, to international energy prices and energy shocks. But we can generate masses of electricity in this
Well, we could also generate vast amounts of oil and gas if Labour hadn't immediately put any new bans on any new
come on, but let's stick
with
pylons. Would you be happy to have them near your home?
Well, when I was 4 or 5 years old, I was obsessed by pylons. I thought they were, every car journey, I'd be pointing them out to my parents. As you can imagine, that went down.
Thrilling.
Would I want one directly outside my house? Probably not. But Peter's absolutely right. If the government is really obsessed by increasing economic growth, you cannot have infrastructure where, say, somebody wanted to create a battery farm for battery factory for electric car batteries. They've been told that it's 3 to 8 years before they could be connected to the grid. Well, they would go elsewhere to do it if that's the case. So the government are going to have to make some really tough decisions and upset people like that lady, I'm afraid, because there is no other choice. I mean, undergrounding, absolutely fine. I don't know the figures, whether it's 5.
Well, those are the figures which say, I think if they...
And ideally, you would put it all underground. But that will take time and it will cost a lot more money.
Well, and the common sense view of building underground cables is it necessarily involves digging up ground, disrupting the natural environment.
Just 1 second.
It's essentially
let her finish.
It's essentially like building an underground motorway. Like, nobody wants to have a pylon being built in their back garden, but would I rather my back garden not built up?
Honestly, pylon, each individual of these are huge pylons as well. They require 9 football fields of concrete base, right, for each of them. So the idea that suddenly these pylons are the environmentally friendly option is absolute nonsense.
Have you put to your constituents, would they be prepared to pay higher bills for those underground cables?
At the moment, what we're actually seeing here is we'll have higher bills, right, and pylons. Right, this is a proposal coming forward from the government.
Well, higher bills for those that don't have the pylons nearby. I mean, Zing, I put to you, a viewer called Tim wrote into BBC Breakfast this morning and said, my house price has gone down by tens of thousands of pounds because of new pylons near me. Does the government really think that 250 quid off my electricity bill is compensation? It was put to the Housing Minister. He didn't have an answer. What would you say?
No, I mean, it's absolutely not the correct amount of compensation, but as you've said, it is necessary if you want to upgrade the energy grid, if you want to bring Britain into the 21st century. You know, so much of our energy grid hasn't been updated for decades because it was created decades ago. I mean, you talk to economists, and part of the reason why the UK has such sluggish growth and has trailed behind its European competitors is because there's a lack of investment in infrastructure.
For the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't trailed behind them in terms of economic growth at all. In fact, before the election, we had higher growth than any other
bit, but it has been stagnant and anemic growth since 2010. So there haven't been huge amounts of growth.
No, but it's
whether the government would like to say
we've been worse than other European countries.
No,
that's
I take that point. But over that period of time. So carry on, Singh.
If we want to invest in skills, if we want to invest in infrastructure, this is the kind of decision that a government has to make. And unfortunately, yes, it will involve angering some local residents.
How does that man know that his house has fallen in value by tens of thousands of pounds? Has he sold his house?
Into Zoopla?
Well, I don't know, but that is the question that was put in. And I suppose the question there is, how can any government compensate somebody for the loss, potentially, of tens of thousands of pounds, Richard?
Well, this is a point I'm keep trying to make, which is why we put forward an underground first option at the election, which is a sensible and right thing to do. Obviously, there are parts of the country where you couldn't do underground cables, but where you can do them, you should do them. And if there's a proper plan that we're going to do this in a large number of places over a long space of time, then actually what you'll also see is cost of it drop. The other side of this coin at the moment, and we've talked a little bit about energy infrastructure, and it's obvious that we need to improve some of that. But the flip side of that is we also need to have a look at other regulations which are in there which are also causing issues around the energy infrastructure. Ian mentioned new car battery plants. Now, I used to do a lot of work with Nissan when I was Transport Minister. You know, they had real issues with connectivity to the grid. Now, that wasn't about overgrounding, undergrounding. That was actually about planning.
Yeah.
Right? But planning, and that was not in green belt areas. That was just normal planning and for major parts of national infrastructure. And it's quite clear that we should be looking at how we can improve that, but without what the government seems to be doing, which is just remove local community involvement. Actually, for things like, you know, those jobs in Sunderland, right, the local community were very much behind it. It was the planning system that was the problem, not the local people.
Well, do you agree with that?
Well, I know that there's a planning bill coming before Parliament, and there's going to be very big changes to the planning arrangements certainly to try and speed things up. You know, we've got to build millions of houses in this country. We've got to put up a whole lot of new infrastructure. We've got to build reservoirs. We've got to sort out the railways. We're going to have to sort out planning for major infrastructure so that we can get on and get Britain building.
But is it right to deprive local communities of a say as to what happens in their backyard?
I don't think that we will be completely depriving local communities of what happens. So I have sat on a planning committee myself in the City Council where I served as a councillor for some time. And to be honest, I will trust the professional planners who know what they're doing. I think that the views of some of the local councillors are sometimes difficult to understand.
Well, Angela Rayner has a huge opportunity here as because she will be in charge of all of these planning reforms.
Yes.
She will hopefully achieve what Michael Gove didn't. And I mean, remember, Michael Gove, it doesn't matter what your politics are, he had a reputation for being a reformer, but in that
department... And they had a big majority as well.
They did. In that department, he singularly failed to reform the planning system. So if she can carry this off, and if at the end of this 5 years that Labour has achieved its housing targets and indeed made it easier for industry to expand, she will be in a very, very good position to succeed Keir Starmer.
Right. Well, Zing, the problem there, potentially, as Ian said, is that they didn't manage to do it under Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, even with a very large majority. How strong is the political will, do you think, with Labour, also with a large majority? Because there will be many MPs, not Peter in this case, who will want to take Richard's position on behalf of their constituents.
I think there's enormous political will on behalf of the public to get Britain building again. You know, everyone you speak to has endured some aspect of the housing crisis, whether or not that's insecure rent, whether or not that's higher house prices, whether or not that's being able to get onto the housing market at all. I think the reason why the pylons have become such a hot button issue is because it touches on a lot of things that English people find incredibly close to their hearts. So protecting nature, protecting the sanctity of their home, you know, protecting their house prices. And I think that's why this in particular has become such a controversial issue. But if Labour were to kind of focus more on the fact that we need to start building houses, we need to start building homes for people that are safe and adequate, I think they will get by much, much further than letting pylons become the issue that dominates kind of this building agenda.
Well, don't forget Politics Live is on at the earlier time of 11:15 tomorrow and every Wednesday, when we'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live and all the build-up beforehand. Now we're getting to Richard's favourite bit. The final stages of the Employment Rights Bill are being debated in the Commons today and tomorrow. One of the amendments by Stella Creasy, Labour MP, calls for paid and protected leave for dads. Joining me now is Elliot Ray, founder of Parenting Out Loud. Welcome to you, the workplace culture change programme for working dads. Elliot, what do you make of the current paternity leave?
I think the current paternity leave is not fit for purpose at all. Around 20% of dads do not take any paternity leave at all. Affordability is the main issue. It's paid at about £184.03 per week for 2 weeks, and that is sad and devastating for so many families.
Do you think the amendment is a positive thing, then, to have more and better paid and protective leave for fathers?
100%. I think the work Stella's doing is great and needed, and it is essential for so many reasons. There was a recent study by PwC that found that closing the gender employment gap could have amazing benefits for the UK economy, around 188 billion we could add to the economy. And enhanced paternity leave can have a major positive impact on that. I think we need at least 6 weeks paid at 90% for dads as a minimum.
Right,
and
so
that
the
would
same
not
as
put us-
maternity. I mean, they have 30... Well, OK, so one of our guests, Ian, has just said by whom? Who are you thinking should pay that?
Well, I think it should be government legislation. I think we would get the benefits back from the economy of putting that money forward in the first place. This is something that is an investment. If we invest in families, invest in dads, we will see the benefits back in the economy through higher participation in the economy. And that would not put us at leading at all across Europe. We look to Denmark and Sweden. They are market leaders. 90% for 6 weeks would be a bare minimum, but I think would make so much impact to dads and families' life. This is really important. You know, gone are the days of men and dads feeling like they have to be just playing the traditional gendered parenting roles of providing and protecting. Men now want things differently. They want to be equal caregivers. There's loads of research from charities like Working Families and Fatherhood Institute shows that men want to do things differently, want to set different examples and live a whole and full life, which involves, yes, working, but it also involves being caregivers, seeing their children grow up and enjoying a full life that comes with parenting as well.
Ian, what's wrong with that?
I struggle with this in the sense that if you really say that the taxpayer, or suggest the taxpayer should be paying the bill here, I mean, if you're on a top salary, £250,000 a year, are you seriously suggesting the taxpayer should subsidise somebody earning that kind of money to the tune of 90% for 6 weeks? 6 weeks. Is that really your suggestion?
Yes. This is going back into our pockets. You know, those high earners or any earner will get the benefits back themselves. They're not paying solely for other people. They are also paying for themselves. Men and dads.
I'm talking about the shop worker at Asda who's earning a couple of £100 a week through part-time work, and part of his or her taxes are going to subsidise somebody on £250,000 a year. That is not a serious proposition.
Elliot?
I would say, Ian, talk to those men, talk to those families. They want this. They want better paternity leave. They have seen the negative impact of not being able to support their partner at home, not having the time to bond with their baby, the negative mental health impacts that puts on themselves and then transfers to higher pressure on the NHS. We have seen the negative impact of dads not being equal caregivers and what that means to gender equality at home and in the workplace.
I'm not suggesting that fathers shouldn't be equal caregivers. I think the whole system needs reform. I think we should be abolishing maternity pay and paternity pay and just doing it all through shared parental allowances. So we don't live in the 1950s anymore. Women are going out to work often. I mean, 18 to 30 women. The gender pay gap is the other way round now. It's women who are earning more than men. So why not have it a sort of joint allowance that can be shared between the two?
Elliot, what do you think of that?
The shared parental leave policy doesn't work. The take-up has been around 2 to 4% of eligible families. It's a complicated, bureaucratic process. And for most families, it's not something that they can take up. So we have tried it. It hasn't worked. What we need now is paid and protected leave for dads. We know that when men and any caregivers are able to spend time with their children, they go through changes. Their brain develops in a different way. Currently, dads are not getting that time to spend that time with their children. That's having negative impact on their mental health.
Okay.
1 in 10 dads and 1 in 5 mums will experience some symptoms of postnatal depression in the first 6 months of their child's life. When we add on complicated births, traumatic births, C-sections, and then we tell a dad to spend 2 weeks in hospital and then go back into work straight after, we are doing a disservice to that family. And that has devastating impacts on everybody, not just that family, but the local community and their workplace.
Let me bring in the other guest. Singh, what do you think of the proposal?
I mean, we have the worst paternity leave policy in Europe. So, 2 weeks at, I think, half the minimum wage. The European average is 8 weeks of full pay. I think we need to get back in step with our European neighbours because, British dads want to stay at home and bond with their children just as much as European ones. What Elliot's saying is completely correct. There's a whole generation of men who are now becoming fathers and are completely shocked at the lack of paternal provision for them. 2 weeks is barely a third of a school holiday. You know what I mean? I mean, there's so many men that I speak to who have just become new dads who are struggling with the fact that they have now feel like they've gone back into the past where they are expected to be the primary earner and the woman is expected to stay at home. That's not a country that's fit for the 21st century.
Should the government take this on? Because it is an amendment by Stella Creasy, Labour MP.
Well, a lot of Labour MPs are supporting this amendment. I saw a letter from Stella Creasy which has many... I am. It has many, many signatures on it. I don't know exactly how many. So
no, it has. It has got a lot. I can't remember the exact number, but it's growing anyway.
So, look, the principle that fathers should be supported to be fathers is exactly the right principle. We can argue a little bit about where the money comes from or how the money...
that is important.
It is important. I mean, I don't think that it's a serious suggestion that a person with an income of £250,000 a year would need to have this additional funding.
But they would be entitled to it.
Yes, they would. I mean, presumably it would be the same as statutory maternity pay.
OK. Look, for myself, I had 3 children a long time ago. I had no paternity leave. My daughter, who's just had her second baby, now 4 months old, her husband had 2 periods of maternity leave, of paternity leave. And I can see a big difference in how a father is able to bond with a young family.
Well, Richard...
So I support it.
Well, Richard, would you support the amendment? And also to Elliot's broad points that actually it will be paid back into not just the family, but also society at large.
On the amendment specifically, I think Ian raises some really fundamental points around that and who are we actually asking to cross-subsidise who. I'm also probably around that sort of point in there where a lot of my friends are having children at the moment, becoming a godfather
on a
regular basis. But no, I think the key thing on this is actually was raised. It's about shared parental leave. Most of the leave which is available for new parents can actually be used by the father or the mother.
But the take-up is very low. Elliot is right.
Elliot is absolutely right that the take-up is far lower for fathers. I do think that there could be that's something we probably as a society need to have a broader conversation about how that is shared better between mother and father. But there's also physical things, childbirth, etc. Mothers often will want that extra time, at home with the new baby themselves as well. So I think this is for individual families will have individual, which is why the flexibility is there, so that they can make those choices for themselves. I don't think it's really for us to mandate. You've got to have at least 6 weeks. I think it's that would
you don't have to.
But that would be potentially taking time off, of a mother being able to spend longer at home as well. So I think we should leave it to families rather than the state being imposing it on people.
Elliot, how confident are you that this amendment will be taken on and things will change?
I hope those MPs stand their ground. I hope they listen to what Stella's doing. I hope they listen to the general public. I hope they do the right thing. And the right thing is supporting the amendment, supporting the bill. If we are serious about gender equality in this country, we know that about 80% of the gender pay gap is the motherhood penalty. If we are serious about women progressing into senior roles, participating in the economy, we have to support dads to be equal caregivers at home. Those two things go hand in hand together. There are so many arguments as to why this is the right thing to do for the economy, morally, for health, for well-being, for families, and most importantly, for children. So I support those MPs. I think they're doing the right thing. And fingers crossed this goes through.
Well, they're listening to you now. Just very briefly.
Stella is a brilliant campaigner, so don't underestimate her.
Well, no, and Elliot, thank you very much for joining us. Just before we go, I have some breaking news. This is about Reform Party and the former Reform MP Rupert Lowe, who was suspended. The Metropolitan Police has launched an investigation into suspended Reform MP Rupert Lowe over an allegation of verbal threats. The Great Yarmouth MP was reported to police on the 6th of March over an allegation. He has denied all of the claims and allegations. It's all we have time for. I will be back at that earlier time of 11:15 tomorrow. And thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. Have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.